Hi, thanks everybody. I feel like the odd one out in this symposium, so I hope that what I have to offer makes sense to you all. And I myself have my background in the environmental humanities, and I actually did my PhD at University of Oregon. So I'm a Northwest person at heart. I lived in Corvallis for that whole time, and then had my first job at University of Alaska Southeast. So I think of myself as a Northwest person. And here in Arcata, California, Northern California, I sort of wish we had more connections, we saw ourselves more as connecting with the Northwest. And so it's fun to be joining you. So I am hoping that I can pitch this in the short amount of time I have in a way that's useful to you. That I recently published a book because of my students' despair around climate justice and problems becoming so disruptive in our class that we couldn't do any of the content of teaching about environmental justice and environmental issues without having to sort of stop and figure out what to do about how we all felt about it. And this was about 2 or 3 years before, or even maybe 5 years before, Greta Thunberg and the youth climate movement kicked onto the scene. In the middle of all this, I was in the middle of trying to write a book for young people called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which I'll talk about in a minute, and have since then been almost swallowed up in the world of figuring out what to do about climate anxiety as climate change seems to be inching closer and closer and closer to us, faster than anyone predicted, or that we could perceive to be predicted. And certainly around youth, which there's been recent research in the last 2 days actually about the impact of climate change on youth emotions and anxiety. That's really fascinating research, and the conversation around this is just exploding. And so I'm hoping to give you a little window into it. Oh, press the button the other way. So in case this particular group needs to be convinced why emotions matter in our climate change work, maybe you don't need to be convinced, but sometimes when I talk with science folks, I think it's worthwhile making the case. I'm going to kind of go through each of these reasons kind of one at a time with just a tiny little window into one of these reasons. Each one of these reasons I could write a whole book about, so I apologize if it doesn't feel adequate. But first, emotions dictate our actions and behavior change more than data or reason-based appeals. This is probably something that you have all experienced in your own personal life and have had frustration around. There was a time when, as a teacher, the assumption was, and students still have this assumption, that if we just inform people more about how bad things are, the automatic assumption is that people will then therefore do the right things in response to those risks that are on the horizon. And it turns out that climate psychologists and conservation psychologists, people doing a lot of work around environmental psychology and communication, are learning that in fact that is not true, and people have wondered why the great certainty and information around climate change hasn't translated into the appropriate public will and political change around it, is because actually in fact emotions dictate those things more than all this great data. The second reason is that science of emotions shows that different emotions shape climate action in different ways, and this is a related point. So it turns out that emotions like guilt and fear and anxiety motivate certain types of behavior change in the short term because we want to get away from negative feelings. This has to do with the parasympathetic nervous system and all kinds of polyvagal theory concepts about what's happening in the brain. And but that positive emotions actually tend to create the conditions for more long-term engagement and more emotional intelligence, more wise action around the kinds of things that we do. And so while we might like the fact that guilt or fear motivates quick change in our audiences, it doesn't necessarily always motivate the right kinds of changes or wise changes, and it doesn't necessarily sustain long-term change. So we want to use the psychology, this sort of science of emotions, much more effectively in our climate work and in our own lives too. The third thing is that our own interior lives affect our ability to engage in climate work. And this comes to the point that I sort of make everywhere I go, which is that if we don't have our own internal resilience worked out and we don't have our own resourcefulness about our own kind of mental and physical health, it's very difficult to engage in these big, challenging, intractable problems such as climate. And so what I say is that the planet needs us to take care of ourselves so that we can do that work. And finally, climate change is increasingly affecting mental health, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but there are actual studies kind of coming out every day about the different ways that climate change is affecting affecting mental health, whether it's in forms of air pollution or increased heat, or just straight up worry about the future. So let's take these sort of one at a time. On the first one, I'm thinking here of Gus Speth's quote where he says, "I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change." And in that first sentence, that accounts for why it is that most environmental concerns have been kind of cordoned off into the category of the sciences, right? The sciences are in the best position and equipped to deal with those problems. And as he says, "I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong." And that goes to the point that emotions actually drive environmental decisions a lot more than data. We need both, but this insight about how strong emotions are in changing behavior has been recently getting more attention. And then he writes, "The top environmental problems are in fact selfishness, greed, apathy, and to deal with this, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that." I think that's actually changing. I think scientists are knowing how to do that. They do realize this, but this is one of the reasons why my own background as an interdisciplinary person, the training I have is to think of all of these tools, from the sciences to the natural sciences, the arts, the humanities, to traditional ecological knowledge. All of these kinds of wisdoms, traditions, and bodies of expertise are going to be needed to do this work and for us to collaborate to do this work. And so this is one of the arguments that I use, and also the data around how it is that people don't make decisions based on logic, they make them on emotion, is really a powerful argument for centering emotion in our climate work. The second point is that the science of emotions shows that different emotions shape our action, and we should use this information strategically. Here I'm thinking about the fact that the vast majority of my students are in a state of constant worry and despair or anxiety, and it shows up in how they're able to get up in the morning and engage in climate work, much less in their studies or coming to classes or to their jobs. And this is where I started to turn all my attention to climate psychology, to think about what were the existential or emotional skills that my students were going to need, in addition to all the content that we were teaching them around climate change, to be able to engage in this work for the long term. And that we were remiss to just leave them with this, apocalypse on the horizon without the existential skills to actually engage this. And this is where the discussion is really turning now in higher education and among youth activists around, okay, this is going to be a lifetime. This is lifetime. This is not just something we can burn out for. What kinds of emotions can we strategically deploy? I'm not assuming that we can always control our emotions around things, but there's all kinds of work that's done in mindfulness, that's done in the field of emotional intelligence, that's done in all kinds of religious traditions, and certainly in neuropsychology, around how it is that we can cultivate the kinds of emotional soil in our own lives that help us engage in this work for the long term. And thinking that the apocalypse is on the horizon turns out to be actually a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy when we think about that psychologically. Oh, I'm trying to move my slide. Sorry, that's how I do it. So for example, as people who work with trauma theory or trauma-informed mindfulness or trauma-informed pedagogy will be familiar with something that comes out of resilience work called the resilience zone, or some people call it the window of tolerance. Dan Siegel calls it the window of tolerance. It's similar, that there's this notion of within our resilience zone, we're not overly stimulated or we're not understimulated. We have our best capacity to do pro-social behavior, to be able to receive information and take the time it takes to figure out what the wise response would be, the responsibility that we can cultivate in that. And so how it is that we can bring resilience training into our pedagogy, into our own work in our own lives as scientists, as you are all. That's just one example of that. So the third point is that our own interior lives affect our ability to engage in climate work. And I don't know about you all, but I've gone through various stages of burnout and despair about what's happening. And I have 2 little kids, and I often wonder what the heck that's about. There is increasingly just so much great research on this. 2 days ago, there was this wonderful report, this global launch of a study that's been done by several of my colleagues out of multiple different institutions, studying 10,000 young people's anxiety related to government inaction. It turns out these emotions, if they can be documented, can really build a case for moral injury in human rights litigation. And so there is a lot of effective strategic reasons why it is that we want to be thinking about emotions. But also, if we think about a whole generation of people being debilitated by climate anxiety, this is not, the future that we hope that they will then therefore manifest and improve is not going to happen. Similar, on the very same day, the Pew Research Center produced a study of over about 46,000 adults across the industrialized nations around their feelings and emotions around and expectations around climate change. This data is really important and helps us, gives us insight as to how it is that we can move forward on climate action. Similarly, among scientists, and I brought this sort of research, just one article, there's a lot of research, especially working, Susan Clayton's work and others have been studying the role of mental health in actual climate scientists and environmental scientists, people who are studying things like extinction of species or biodiversity loss, and the mental health consequences of seeing that loss so up close and personal, what that means for climate scientists and how it is that they need to engage in that in their own emotional lives and their own grief in order to continue to do the work, including hostility from others and various other things. So Susan Clayton's work has been really groundbreaking on this front. And again, all kinds of news articles about scientists reporting their profound sense of loss as the climate emergency worsens. And so there's all kinds of, infrastructure building around how to support scientists who are doing this work. And then finally, climate change is increasingly affecting mental health. And I just really quickly want to list off some examples of this: extreme weather events, displacement, environmental traumas, worry about the future, grief about losses. And I want to make sure I'm really clear about that these kinds of environmental or climate related traumas often exacerbate existing traumas. And so they compound existing inequalities across the globe. And I've written a book. This is the book I just mentioned I wrote that addressed this specifically for young people, the climate generation, as I call them, or Generation Z. But I do think it has resonance and accessibility to anybody who's really concerned. I really was frustrated with books about 10 things I can do to save the planet, and there's a million books like that out, and I have never been able to. I needed to have something deeper and maybe more existential to shift in myself before I could even take any of those actions. And so I really wanted to focus on what it is what we could do in our heads right now, in our hearts right now, before we even did any actions, to think differently about the climate crisis so that we can use all the science of emotions to engage better. And including things like ditching guilt, moving beyond hope, and laughing more, and figuring out how to resist burnout, all kinds of sort of tips that I use a lot of research to study. And here's some of the research in italics, which I'm just throwing out there so you can see it in front of you. If any of these things excite you, you can go look it up a little bit more. And in the spirit of concluding, I just am leaving us all kind of with our own personal checklist. We are obviously, the purpose of all this interior work to keeping ourselves resilient in our resilience zone is not so that we can just feel good and adapt to the horrors around us and have comfort again, but rather it is to keep ourselves resourced so that we can keep working on fixing these larger structural problems. So I'm not suggesting we focus entirely on our interior lives at the expense of what's happening out in the world and the structural work that still remains to be done. In fact, that's really where all of the work needs to be done. But in order to do that, are we personally resourced? We can act intelligently and wisely if we are. Are we living in a story of resilience, hope, and progress, or one of decline, unraveling, and apocalypse? And there's all kinds of research about how powerful the stories that we live in are to the decisions that we make. Are we aware that we aren't acting alone? And again, a lot of research on the importance of being in collective or community in our activism and in sort of dismantling the mythologies around individualism that have gotten us into these problems in the first place. Especially with youth, there's a sense of helplessness among youth. Are we visioning what we want? What kinds of collective structures of mutual support do we want instead? What do we desire about the future? And I think this really goes against the stories that everything that's about to happen on the horizon is going to be really horrific. I think that is true for a lot of people for whom the the norm or the status quo of extraction has benefited and helped immensely, but for people for whom that hasn't been comfortable, it's easier to imagine alternatives and to get and to feel okay about what kinds of structures are actually on the demise. Um, and do you feel that you have control over some conditions of your life? And so I think a lot of my students anyway feel that they have very little control over so much of these huge scale problems. And especially in COVID, the isolation has compounded all of these problems too. So we have to actively work to cultivate having hope and community, and investigating the role of grief and anxiety and how it's affecting our ability to do the work. And so I often, when I'm in my lowest of low points, remind myself of the thing that's right in front of me that I love, and start there again, to get that feedback, those positive feedback loops started, so I can get the energy back to get to my resource so I can keep doing my work. So that's sort of where I'm going to leave it with you. A few beautiful books that y'all might enjoy if you liked anything that I had to say to you today. I only had 15 minutes and I'm sorry to go a little bit over that, but here are some of my favorite books. Some of these you might know about. Ellen Kelsey's book down there in the bottom right corner is brand new out, and I don't think there's much not underlined in my copy of that book, and I'd strongly point to that book. And these are books that have shaped the things I'm thinking about. I'm not coming up with this stuff on my own. I'm really drawing on so much research that's being done out there to put these ideas together for you today. So thank you.